One of the 14 prisoners was named Lebbeus Hammond. Another was named Joseph Elliot. Lebbeus Hammond tells the story that the captives were forced in small groups to kneel with their heads on the rock while Queen Esther, still crazed by the death and dishonoring of Gensho, carried out her vows of vengeance. She was personally executing them one at a time by smashing their skulls with a large war club. Lebbeus Hammond's version of the story goes on to say that he and Elliot were at the rock together and were about to become the last two victims. He noticed that whenever Queen Esther was poised with a war club high over her head, the Indians seemed to be transfixed by all of the gore, the sheer drama of the event, and the anticipation of the coming blow. And he whispered to Elliot, "When she gets that club over my head, let's bolt and try to get out of here." When the time came, that's exactly what they did, and in an instant they were both free and running for their lives down the steep bank and into the high vegetation of the lower flats. After a few minutes of desperate sprinting, they separated. Elliot headed for the river, and Lebbeus kept on a path through the woods. Then he tripped and fell headlong down a low bank into a tangled mass of brambles and brush. At the time he thought that surely he would now be caught and killed. To surprise, his pursuers ran right on by him, and he was able to remain hidden until darkness allowed him to make his way back to 40 Fort. Elliot, in the meantime, made it to the river. Being a strong swimmer, was able to make it out into the main stream before his pursuers saw him and started firing. Then, by swimming underwater as much as possible, he avoided all but one of their shots. That one hit him just below his right shoulder and disabled his right arm. But he was still able to swim on his back and keep going until he reached the safety of the far shore. Once on land, he stopped his bleeding by stuffing moss into his wound and made his way painfully back to 40 Fort. Now, there's another side to this story. It's told by all of my Indian friends, whether Delaware or Seneca. They insist that Queen Esther was much too refined and gentle a person to have ever taken part in such a brutal orgy of human slaughter. Similar versions of this story are told in virtually all the white history books, and they're deeply hurtful and disturbing to them. They further point out that some accounts describe the executioner as a very tall, strong woman, and Queen Esther was neither tall nor strong. I have some final comments, but they're going to be based on another episode still to come, and so must wait until the end of this story. By the 4th of July, 1778, Colonel Butler demanded the surrender of 40 Fort and all of its guns, ammunition, and other military supplies. He promised to protect the lives of the survivors in the fort, providing they would, in turn, sign a sworn statement that they would never again raise arms against the king. He would not promise to protect any of their property. They, of course, had little confidence in his promises. They were the kind routinely demanded in all similar situations, and history records they were just as routinely broken. But they had no option. And after some token attempts at negotiation, they accepted his terms, with only slim hopes that he would keep his promise about their personal safety. The Indians, of course, were flush with victory and wanted more scalps and more prisoners. Butler, however, was able to persuade them that if they wanted any more help from the king, they would have to obey his orders. There are many stories of atrocities after the surrender of the fort, but most historians today believe them to be exaggerations amplified by every retelling. There was plunder on a grand scale, as was standard practice by all sides in warfare at that time. The Indians and Butler's Rangers both took part in the looting, and everything of value was either carried away or burned. The owners watched helplessly as their most prized possessions, everything of value, was carried away, often demanded and physically removed from the wearer. Finally, the buildings and crops were all burned and destroyed. When the looting and the burning and the destroying was finally finished, Butler and his army left confident they had at last taught the rebels a convincing lesson. Their cause was doomed, and their only safety lay in leaving the Wyoming Valley forever. The survivors, now stunned by the overwhelming loss of so many husbands, sons, and fathers, were now homeless, without food, and with only the clothes on their back. Many of them were too elderly, sick, or wounded to consider the 60-mile trail over rough mountainous and wilderness terrain to Stroudsburg. But again, there was no alternative. Most of them banded together and managed to survive the ordeal. Some of the weakest perished along the way. Among the survivors was a 12-year-old girl named Mary Whitaker. She and her father had moved to Wyoming from Minisink only a few years before the battle, and they both made it to Stroudsburg and back to Minisink. Mary insisted for the rest of her life that Joseph Brant had saved her while the Indians were pillaging inside the fort. All of the settlers were cowering in a corner expecting to be killed when Joseph Brant held her up by her hair and painted her face red with the other hand. "That will save you," Brant told her. However, Mary was mistaken. Joseph Brant was never at Wyoming that summer. He was known beyond all question to have been 70 miles away at Oquaga. Probably the Indian chief who painted Mary's face red was Kaying Waruto. The following year, however, Joseph Brant and his Mohawks did raid Minisink and burned and destroyed all of the buildings and property. This time Mary, now 13, hid with others in a potato hole over which they slid some boards. She remembered being close enough to have touched their feet as they stood talking on the boards, but fortunately they never looked under the boards. 88 years later, Mary's great-great-granddaughter, a young woman named Marietta Doane, married the great-grandson of Lebbeus Hammond, a young man named Jeffrey Sly. I remember Marietta Doane. She's my great-grandmother. So G and Jeffrey, well, that makes Lebbeus Hammond my great-grandfather's great-grandfather, and Mary Whitaker my fifth great-grandmother. You can be absolutely certain that through all of those generations, until 10 years ago, there's never been any doubt that Lebbeus told the truth about Queen Esther. After all, he and Elliot were the only two white people known to have seen that show and lived to tell about it. They presumably both knew Queen Esther because she was known to have frequently come to Wyoming to trade. Yet, on the other hand, they both say her body and face were heavily painted with all kinds of weird garish designs. We know Mary Whitaker was mistaken about Joseph Brant. Could Lebbeus have been just as mistaken about Queen Esther? If he had heard even a murmur that this gruman apparition of a woman was Queen Esther, would he have been in any mood to question the rumor? One of the final outcomes of the Wyoming Valley Massacre was the loud and continuous demand for Congress to authorize a counter-invasion of the Iroquois League, large enough to stop forever these frontier raids. Congress's reaction was at first favorable, and Washington was officially instructed to start plans for a major campaign starting the following spring. During that fall, Congress lost some of its interest. The costs were too high and the difficulties of a large wilderness campaign too uncertain. Then in November that same year, the Tories and Indians struck again, this time at Cherry Valley in New York, led by Captain Walter Butler and Joseph Brant. This time there were more civilian casualties, and most of them carried out by Butler's Rangers. Congress was turned on again, and Washington followed by appointing Major General John Sullivan to command the campaign. To guarantee success, he authorized 1/3 of his entire regular army, over 5,500 men, organized in 4 regiments from Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts, each commanded by their own brigadier general. There are other reasons for the Sullivan campaign. why it was planned. But without Wyoming Valley and Cherry Valley massacres, they never would have been approved. And I've used up my time. And I'll be glad to answer any questions that I will try.